Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Pad. I'm the Peacemonger. It is Wednesday, the 11th of February, on a very kind of very damp month in England, has to be said. I'm glad to be welcoming back again Lord Robert Skidelsky, a renowned academic, expert on the works of John Maynard Keynes, and also a member of the House of Lords, Emeritus Professor at Warwick University uh, as well. Robert, welcome back.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Now, you wrote a very good article in Responsible Statecraft recently on the back of the decision finally by the British government to allow the Chinese to build their new super embassy in Old Mint Court in the city of London, about our paranoia, how we've entered paranoid corner here in Britain about these dreaded foreigners coming in and setting up embassies and other things. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there's the event itself, but paranoia um, depends on a deluded interpretation of an event. And so something happens, and then you interpret it in a way that is, that it's hostile to you, that you're being persecuted, that it's the action of something malign. And then it's closely connected, in my mind, to conspiracy theory, which is there will always some secret layer of explanation going on, which isn't on the surface and which the press and the media don't really deal with. And that, of course, is even stronger when there is some feeling that the press is very biased and isn't an impartial conveyor of news any longer. And so you have a conspiracy theory. And then there's something I call confirmation bias, which is that every event that happens is then misinterpreted in the light of the previous assumption. I mean, a good example is, of course, the mega embassy, the mega Chinese embassy that's going to go up in London. Permission has been given by the government for that to happen. Now, this is, first of all, China is interpreted as a malign power. That's the premise of the argument. And it must be a malign power because it's a dictatorship. And we know dictatorships are always they're contrary to our values. So it builds this embassy. But what is the embassy really? Think of its location. It must be in the middle of London, a huge spy centre. And the underground tunnels, and that will give access to underground networks, underground communications networks. And it's right in the City of London, so they'll be able to hack into our financial center. All of this comes out of the Chinese request to build a new embassy to replace the old embassy. Now, that's, to my mind, paranoia. But there are many, many other examples of that. Russian ships that take shelter in the Bristol Channel, for example, is one example, is naturally a spy ship. And it's sort of mapping underground cables. And we then have to counter that by drones, getting drones over all the Russian ships that are going around. And so the whole thing builds up into something completely mad. Now, I mean, espionage is as old as time. We always spy. I mean, spies are a very, very old profession. I mean, maybe prostitution and spying have equal longevity in our history, and so that shouldn't worry us. But it's the idea, at some point in international relations, the spying starts to sort of be determinative of our view of what's going on, and that's when it becomes very, very dangerous. Because if you believe you're under attack by malign forces, then you have to respond. And then gradually the whole of life becomes a surprise, and you're always looking out for some hidden motive, some hidden actor. And to my mind, that is sort of, the path to madness. You can't live a normal life or sort of have a proportionate view of what's going on if you're subject to these kind of mental delusions. And I think that's what's happening. I'm afraid it's in the press, it's in the media, Daily Telegraph, even New Statesman. They're sort of full of paranoid uh, remarks and articles.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, we spy on China, China spies on us. But an embassy serves a much kind of bigger purpose than that. It's to develop relations, between the two
Of course,
countries.
you know about that. You were in the Moscow embassy. So who was spying on whom?
Well, we were spying on the Russians. Russians were spying on us, and our own people were also spying on us to make sure that we weren't helping the Russians. So it kind of worked that way. And I'm sure there's somebody in the Russian embassies keeping an eye on the Russian embassy staff too to make sure they're
Yeah,
not spying for Britain. So I mean that's just in the nature of the game. Every embassy has spies, but actually, I mean, embassies perform a much bigger function, of course. And China is now by PPP, the biggest economic power. We want apparently to strengthen economic relations, with China. And I think actually, by the way, the decision by the Starmer government finally to agree to the embassy was the correct decision. You need to have embassies, recognizing that they also, a part of those embassies conduct espionage activities. That's just a risk you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But
yeah.
these kind of reports completely distract us from actually the bigger picture of where we want our relationship to develop. And it seems to me that we do want, and actually one of the few things I give Rachel Reeves credit for is she does want to strengthen UK-China economic relations, like she does want to strengthen our relations with the EU and also the US, and not be forced to choose sides.
Yeah, yeah,
This kind of paranoid reporting just tries to alienate us, from the Chinese,
yeah.
tries to introduce turbulence into, a relationship that needs mending.
Yeah. I mean, there is the really interesting question whether any of this spying does any good. I mean, it's a game and it goes on, and the people who play it are obviously fascinated by it and love it. And we've got lots of films made about all this, and of course, there's James Bond, and I mean, there's a whole genre of literature. Um, to do with spying and films to do with spying. It's glamorous. Does it do any good? Does it make a jot of difference to anything? Um, or does it simply cancel each other out and it's a game within a game? I mean, where it might make a difference is if it reaches a point of attention whereby you really start, as you just said, framing your foreign relations in terms of this spying espionage game. Then, of course, it becomes dangerous because then it can escalate. It's interesting on the question of Starmer's visit to China that many of our leading newspapers called it kowtowing, Britain kowtowing, this word of bending the knee to this malign power, when instead we should have been resolutely confronting that power and defending our values. I mean, it's as though there's no need to get on with anyone else. That, the world is full of countries, as you've just said, with rather differing views of things, but they have to get on with each other if we're not to blow each other up or if we're not to blow the planet up. So, that's my basic view. These delusions should be kept in proportion uh, and given their weight, but no more than their weight.
Yeah. So, I mean, from my point of view, a big part of spying is just finding out information that isn't available in the public domain.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and the reason that happens is to kind of help a government just make sense of whether its policy is right. Say, for example, we want to invest in a strengthened relationship with China. We kind of want some reassurance, I suppose, that the Chinese are sincere, that they want to kind of strengthen the relationship with us too, or whether there are some other agendas or subplots behind the scenes that aren't available in public media reporting and that sort of stuff. So, spying sort of serves that purpose in terms of generating information that isn't, it is secret information,
Yeah, I can see
which
that.
helps. So,
But
I mean,
it's just doing the work of Chat GTP or an AI. I mean, if
it,
it's simply gathering information that's already in the public sphere in a convenient form for another government to digest, why do you need spies? Why not just have AIs that can scrape the data and present it to the interested government?
yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, it's information that should be in the public domain.
Are spies about to become obsolete? Is AI about to make this oldest of human professions obsolete?
Yeah,
Are
it's a
they
good.
desperately fighting for their place? These Russian nuns who are really FSB agents, are they fighting for their, against obsolescence, against redundancy?
These Russian nuns in Sweden, yeah, selling trinkets to fund Putin's war machine. Yeah, that's a really good. That's a really good example in your article. I mean, it's a good question because in some areas, in some countries, a lot of the spying has to be done through electronic means, of course, because you can't. I mean, to get really up close relationships, it's hard if you're a white English male in China, as opposed to somebody of Chinese ethnicity, to kind of build those links. So there's a basic kind of ethnic, limitations to it, of course, and of course there's a crossover between actually just normal diplomatic engagement, where you meet people all the time, you get their views on what's happening in the government, and they tell you what they want you to hear, and you sort of feed that back to sort of capitals and so on. There's always been that question about how that differs from a spy actually meeting somebody and talking to them,
Well,
and getting
yeah,
information from them. So,
sure. I mean, I've got another case which isn't exactly paranoia, but it's certainly conspiracy theory. Jeffrey Epstein. This is the story
oh
of the
yes,
last 2 weeks. Now, it's known. The fact is that he was very rich. So the question is, how did he get his money? Well, you look around and he didn't seem to be doing anything that was obviously money making. Therefore, he must be a spy of some kind. Therefore, he's either a Russian spy, um, an asset, a Russian asset, or the other theory is that he's an asset of Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. They give him the money to enable him to lead the kind of life that will entrap famous people who can then be blackmailed. I mean, that's the story. True or not? I'm very skeptical. Because what there's a confirmation. You start with the fact that Epstein was very rich, which is true. But you then assume that he must have got his money through these sort of governments for whom he was acting. Whereas in fact, you then look into the detail, and you find actually it was business contracts of one kind or another, which may not have been very above board, but didn't involve other governments. They involved generally American businessmen who gave him money for some consultancies and things like that. But you can see how you start with something and then you immediately, by some logical process, get to a conclusion that just isn't right. And I think that's. I mean, I don't know enough about it, and therefore I may be wrong about this. But my instinct is that he wasn't working for either Russia or Mossad. So there we are.
yeah.
Anyway, this isn't what you wanted to talk
It
about.
isn't, but I'm actually quite enjoying the conversation anyway. So let's just kind of go with it, because it's an interesting one. I think that the big problem I have with the conspiracy theories about Epstein working for Mossad, Epstein working for Russia is that they are just that. No evidence has been presented. You see Radek Sikorski on LBC interview, like a man chewing an angry wasp, talking about all this evidence that has to be uncovered about Epstein working for the Russian intelligence. Well, that to me is not really far removed from from the newspaper stories that actually the Russians are recycling spare parts from washing machines for their tanks because they don't have any equipment, or
Yeah.
the latest blinder that the Russian soldiers are forced to eat pigeons, because the Russian government can't afford to give them food. I mean, there's just always a long list of these fantastical stories, which are unbelievable. And by the way, you pay a lot of money for a good quality pigeon in a very fine Michelin-starred London restaurant. So I found that story particularly confusing. But that's not the point. The point is that that this kind of excites an audience that wants to have constant reaffirmation that actually we're being spied upon by the Russians and the Chinese,
Yeah.
all the time, and Epstein is part of that plot. My
Yeah.
problem with it is that actually it's rooted in some sort of John le Carré-esque Cold War logic. Because if you look at the famous spies, sort of Soviet spies, of the past, or Penkovsky or Gordievsky, and so on. They came over out of an ideological opposition to the Soviet Union, the system of the Soviet Union, and they wanted to come over and work for the kind of the West, and spy to sort of undermine that Soviet system, right? I mean that's why they did it. They weren't. I mean, obviously they were well paid, but they weren't really driven by money. They're driven by belief. And the problem with the Epstein theory, whether it's Mossad, whether it's the SVR, is that actually, what was the ideological basis for him to want to do that for over 20 years for a
Yeah.
country that was no longer the Soviet Union, which was now a reduced, economically reduced, geographically kind of smaller state, with the ideological piece having fallen by the wayside. I mean, it just doesn't really make any sense. It makes for a fun story. It gives the Poles more things to accuse the Russians of course. But does it make sense? I personally don't really think
Well, you
that it
see,
does.
yeah, I mean, what's replaced the socialist capitalist ideological battle, or the communist capitalist ideological battle, which was the bedrock of the Cold War? What's replaced that is the democracy dictatorship
Yeah,
ideology. You see, we have our values. I mean, we now talk about values. Values and national security seem to be in the same breath, really. We're defending our values. Our values, as any person who wants to acquire British citizenship will learn, are democracy, rule of law, human rights, basically those three. Now, these other people are against our values, and therefore they're seeking to undermine them in some way. Therefore, almost anything they do in relation to us is an attack on our values. I mean, it starts with I think, a premise as simple as that. Therefore, I mean, the people who may be these so-called, in fact, alleged, because this case was dismissed, parliamentary researchers who are passing non-classified information to the Russians. By the way, it wasn't classified, it was public information.
the Chinese, you mean?
I mean, to the Chinese. They weren't doing it. They might have been doing it because they genuinely believed that in helping the Chinese. From an ideological point of view, it may be the allegation would then be that they might have got money as well. But that was also true of spies. I mean, there was always this mixture of money and ideology. And I think that's true, and that's always been true. My question is, did the spies ever do any good? I mean, was the Cold War shortened by 1 year by the activities of the spies? did they have a major impact on any of the events um, of the Cold War? I mean, maybe the answer is they did, but I'm a bit skeptical. I think this was a game within a game, within a bigger game, and this game people loved doing it. I mean, their psychologies were such that they enjoyed spying.
Well, and people love talking about it and reading about it in John le Carré novels and watching The Night Manager, and things like that. I mean, I happen to believe that the person who was living in China, there's good evidence that, by any definition, he would classify it as a spy and is handling the chap working in London. But that's just my view. I've written about this
Yeah, yeah.
before, and the crossover of the National Security Act meant that he was not able to be prosecuted under the terms of the new act. But that's just my view.
Do you believe that uh, Chinese, there are about 150,000 Chinese students at British universities. Do you believe they're all potential agents of the Chinese government? That they're instructed to send back information to the Chinese government, which would help them in their sort of hostile activities? Do you believe that?
No, I mean a small number
Some
might
might,
be, a small
some
number
might.
might be, but again, the question there, the question there is really, what useful intelligence can they possibly be gathering?
Yeah, yeah,
Working, going to some, I don't know, Nottingham Trent University or wherever, what possible either tactical intelligence or strategic intelligence that really has a policy impact. What could they possibly be saying? That diplomats in the embassy can't pick up just from reading the newspapers or traveling around the country themselves. So I think no. I think most of them are just students of probably upper middle class, relatively affluent families who can afford to study in the UK, and they see the prestige in doing so. But there might be a small number, who are, of course, but I suspect that the value is incredibly low. I mean, I was engaging a lot with Russian students when I was in Moscow, and there was absolutely no intelligence benefit there at all, quite
yeah,
frankly.
yeah.
And my colleagues from the other side, said so, and no interest at all. So I think very, very kind of low grade, but it makes for a good story.
But it
On
has
your
some, yeah, but it has some consequences because instructions go out to vice chancellors to be,
to,
wary of
to
this possibility, and then courses get influenced, and so it works its way through the system.
Yeah.
Something just which is of no importance at all, and yet it filters through, and that's the danger.
That is a danger, and of course, we're looking for Reds under every bed, and we're shutting down Russian language courses. We're shutting down Mandarin language courses, also Arabic courses, because universities don't have any money anyway, and we're trying to prevent foreign students coming, even though they bring a lot of money into our economy as a valuable
Yeah, yeah.
service export, for the UK. But there you are. I mean, on your specific question about have they ever made any difference? In the strategic sense, possibly no. In the tactical sense, possibly yes, in terms of dealing with specific threats as they arose. You look at what MI5 does, and they interdict, terrorists before they're able to kind of launch attacks.
Yeah,
Sometimes they're
yeah,
not
yeah.
successful, but many times they are. We don't sort of read about the details, but on that tactical level, I think it can be kind of beneficial. But in the big picture, it's a big question mark, and of course the challenge today. And so briefly pausing on the 150,000 Chinese students, add to that the 150,000 Russian people who live in the UK, of Russian kind of heritage. Well, we don't have the same benefit in those countries. So, we don't have that same footprint. There's a tiny expat community in Russia. There's a probably slightly larger, community, in China. So we have less of a launch pad, but is it really kind of valuable anyway? It's a big question, big question mark. The risk today, I think, is actually that the intelligence services are now so powerful internally, certainly in the UK. And I think, in Russia too, probably, but it's debatable where. whether they've got more power than ours internally, but they have so much influence over the contours of policy making, foreign
Yeah,
policy making,
yeah, yeah,
which is not their role. You know,
yeah,
the intelligence folk are meant to gather intelligence, right? I mean, that's what
yeah.
they do. They're meant to do the operational stuff as well when they have to do that. They're not actually intended. The purpose of the intelligence agencies isn't to formulate foreign policy. They're a tool of foreign policy.
I
They
know.
shouldn't be the author of the foreign policy. And I think that is the challenge that we face in the UK today.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. They drive foreign policy instead of being the tools of it. I'm sure that's right. If your foreign policy frame is that you are in a state of war with countries A, B, C, and D, which that is the policy frame. It's not called war, it's undeclared war, it's warfare. It's just below the threshold. But nevertheless, it is war, it's not peace. Therefore, you have to organize society to meet it. And if that's the view, and of course, that's a view that intelligence likes, intelligence services like that view, the military like that view as well, because it gives them a key function in the organization of society. So one has to attack it at the higher level and say we are not at war with these countries. We're at peace with these countries, and not things are going on we don't like. We've got to go and talk to them about it and see if we can, you know, improve the situation. That is my view, but apparently that's not at all acceptable.
well, the thing is, you know, that in a state of warfare or a condition of warfare, then you know the intelligence agencies, let's say
Greyfare, isn't it called Greyfare? One of the words for it.
grey fair, let's call it
Yeah,
that. Starting to get Tolkien-esque now, but it is that they gain budgets and money, you know, from this condition, and it's in their a bit like the UN peacekeeping operation that never winds down because you know the contributing countries would lose the money if it did. Now, intelligence agencies, you know, military bureaucrats, I mean,
yeah,
they need an external threat to generate the
yeah,
you know the budgets,
sure.
the growing budgets. But of course, when they're also the people setting the policy, you know, the foreign policy, you know that incentivizes them to kind of have a more antagonistic policy because their budgets depend on it. I mean, I think that is a big problem. I spoke about this in my book, in Misfit in Moscow, um, where you know back in 2015, I think a joint cross Whitehall unit. We like cross Whitehall units in Whitehall. Whether they do any good is another matter. But it was joint led by somebody from the SIS, you know, MI6 as people otherwise kind of know it. And I thought at the time that I said in the book that this you know gave them far too much influence over the design of foreign
Yeah.
policy.
I
I
think
think
there is a genuine role, and I accept that, in protecting our country against terrorism. I mean, I see that as a genuine role for an intelligence service. There are
yeah.
terrorists, and we have had terrorist incidents. We could then ask, why did these people become terrorists? And we may then want to go into the history of our involvement in the Middle East and elsewhere. But nevertheless, the fact is that there they are, and they would probably wreak a lot of damage unless they were prevented from doing so. And that is a genuine role for the intelligence services in our era, in our age. I do not think they have a genuine role in preventing Russian aggression or Chinese aggression. I think that is where we get to the paranoid corner, and and the danger, as you rightly say, it drives foreign policy. You get a strategic defense review like the Robertson
Mm.
defense review in November, and that drives foreign policy. It makes a foreign policy assumption there. The government accepts it, and policy then has to deliver on that assumption. And then the government can be attacked, or the authority. You're not spending enough. You're not spending what you pledged to. You're not doing it fast enough. You're not coordinating your activities properly. And so a whole line of criticism of government action flows from the initial assumption that we're in a state of war. I mean, it would be as though, people in 1940 were saying to Churchill, hey, why haven't you set up the proper machinery for conducting this war? You know, um, it's the same kind of mental atmosphere, which is deeply worrying, of course.
Yeah, of course. And the other, threat, I suppose, to us in the UK is the the widespread and insidious nature of the influence that the intelligence agencies have over our domestic media and over our domestic politics.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
look at the number of members of parliament who are ex-military types. You look at the number of newspaper pundits who are ex-military and security kind of types. You look at other high-profile figures who seem to get lots of column inches, like Christopher Steele, the guy who did Russiagate, and is now pushing the Epstein is a Russian spy kind of line. These people with links to the agencies of the state, are prominent in the media, in our parliament, and elsewhere, and they influence the public debate on what our foreign policies should be. So
yeah.
it's like the self-looking to ice cream cone. I mean, the government says that Russia's a threat, and the newspapers and the parliamentarians all agree, and everything's mutually reinforcing. I think that is
And
another sort of big
yeah,
part of the
I,
problem.
I think international relations has always been slightly suspect as a discipline, just because it's so closely involved in relations between governments. I mean, there has been an attempt to develop it as an independent theory. So we talk about the realist theory of international relations, idealist theories, and so on, to make it a serious academic subject. But its links to government have always been stronger than that with other disciplines. I mean, there used to be something called international history, and then you studied the history of things. And even now, the people who are actually most sane about international relations are really professors in history departments who sort of look at the history of things. I mean, they're wonderful people like Richard Sakwa, who looks at the history of Ukraine. Um, but that's no longer, but he's not international relations. So I think the problem you identify, the close links between the intelligence services and international relations elite, Chatham House, for example, in the UK, is not fortuitous. It was always there, um, which makes me suspicious about the academic or scholarly credentials of international relations.
Yeah, I mean, my problem with international relations as a kind of an academic discipline is that there's no connection with the practice of international relations and diplomacy. I meet international relations students when I visit, British universities, and none of them have a clue about how to kind of design a foreign policy, a proposal for a minister. They're full of theories and this and that, and they're kind of yeah, belt fed,
Yeah.
the latest tropes about kind of Russia and China. But
We've lost the idea of what diplomacy means. I mean, you were a diplomat.
yeah,
And what does diplomacy mean? What does it mean? What are you there to do? To talk and negotiate and listen and learn about, the people you're dealing with. I mean, we don't do that any longer.
yeah. I mean, the overriding aim of diplomacy is or should be to kind of promote improved relations between states at a bilateral level. Obviously, there's the multilateral angles to it and that sort of thing, thematic aspects and so on in terms of various global policy issues. But for my, as a very much a bilateralist a diplomat, it's about promoting improved relations between your states. Now, it's easy if you're, a British diplomat in Switzerland. I mean, not difficult to have good relations with the Swiss, although I'm sure there's still things we disagree with, even with the Swiss on, in terms of the cheese they like and things like that, perhaps. Cowbells and so on. But if you're in Russia, it's a much harder it's a much harder task because
Yes.
our government doesn't trust them and they don't trust us. So, you have to build relationships. And actually, the purpose of that for the diplomat is to gain trust, gain insight, try and influence some on key issues, but also feed insights back to London to say, well, actually, our foreign policy is kind of landing in this way. It's not working. Sanctions aren't working. Something I said very often, sadly, falling on deaf ears. But to try and shape from afar, the foreign policy process.
Mm.
But unfortunately, I mean that's what diplomacy should be in the interest of improving UK-Russia relations, which are worse now than they've ever been, even probably during the Soviet period.
Yeah. 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 I agree.
Remarkably. But unfortunately, the diplomats are drowned out because the policy machine in Whitehall is so big, and the influence of the agencies, is so significant that actually, if you're sending in a telegram from Moscow, you're just one tiny voice, knocking on the thick metal walls of the echo chamber, trying to get heard, and very often not being let in. I
Yeah.
think that's the reality.
And you're right. I think it's worse than in the Cold War. New areas of the world are being opened, are being militarized, and the latest is the battle for the Arctic.
Yeah.
And that was not a battle in the Cold War. I mean, the anecdotes of the person on the Norwegian side and the person on the Russian side, and they'd meet every day for a glass of vodka. I mean, the only disturbances were reindeer and things like that. But now it is weaponized because of climate change. Of course, it's all going to get warmer, therefore more accessible, and all the powers are now in for the Battle of the Arctic. So that is a new front, if you like, that hadn't opened up in the Cold War. Um, to me, it's deeply worrying. What one should be doing is saying, look, this is a planetary event. Let's make the best use of this development for the planet as a whole. Let's make sure the planet as a whole benefits, if indeed there is warming taking place in the Arctic, as there bound to be, not weaponize it and make it a battle between the great powers, the great predators of the world, prowling around trying to get benefit. And we must join that battle, or else they'll take over the Arctic, and God knows what terrible things will happen to us. This mindset fills me with despair.
Yeah, it does. I just wrote an article in Responsible Statecraft as well on the Arctic and how a
On
lot
the
of it's
Arctic, you've written about it too, yeah.
yeah, about a lot of it's about shipping. I mean, the Russians are a decade ahead, on that. But I mean, of course, the NATO mongers. I mean, that they see that Russia has over 50% of the Arctic coastline is Russia,
Yeah,
and actually, the world is a lot closer together at the top than it is in the middle,
yeah.
of course. So yeah, it is being weaponized. I'm not entirely sure that the Russians want it to be, weaponized. But I mean, the Trump administration, despite the kind of rhetoric about a reset, with the Russians, seem to be ramping up there. But that was in the Biden strategy as well. I mean, the Biden Arctic strategy of 2024, was moving in that direction. NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, when he was the NATO Secretary General, he was talking about beefing up NATO in the Arctic. So this isn't something that's specific to the Trump administration.
No,
He's
no.
just brought more focus to it through his land grab on Greenland, which may also
Yeah.
be as much about US-Canada relations and access to the Northwest Passage, which the Canadians claim kind of sole control of, or try to at least.
Yeah.
And
Okay, how do you get out of the mindset in which you see the world as um, made up of a bunch of these predatory great powers, and they'll gobble you up unless you're one of them, and therefore you're in a constant competition, which could easily escalate and might well escalate if people uh, are aware of this possibility, but it doesn't seem to worry them too much, into real fighting and devastating fighting. How do you get out of that particular mindset? Um, which dominates the foreign offices and foreign military foreign establishments of nearly all the countries that could expect to have any say in the outcome. I mean, how do you get out of it? You're a peacemonger. Your program is a peacemonger. How do you get peacemongering taken seriously?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in the mindset of young people, entering politics
Okay,
and calling for a change.
that may be the hope.
I think there's no hope at the moment, certainly for the political elite in the UK in the Uniparty. I'm not entirely sure that reform is offers anything different either on the world stage in terms of its foreign policy. Farage tried to dip his toe in the water of saying it is NATO, the fault of NATO expansion was quickly battered down, and that hasn't said anything since. It's deeply ingrained. But I think people increasingly kind of are fed up of this, and they want, at a time of declining power, certainly for the UK, I can't talk for the Americans. People increasingly want us to kind of focus on British problems for British people, like
Yeah,
having schools, hospitals. So the only hope for peacemongering is really in the next generation, the people that want to. I mean, we talk about diversity. I mean, peacemongering is fundamentally all about curiosity and being interested in your fellow man,
yeah, yeah,
whatever their nationality, race, religion, sexual preference, whatever it
yeah,
may
yeah.
be. And I think that the only hope is in the new generation. And the risk, of course, is that they gradually, as they percolate up through the system, the press, the constant bombardment of press reporting that they're bad and we're good will gradually kind of taint them, and they'll just eventually end up like the people at the top now. So I mean that's a risk that we need to try and arrest through peacemongering, if that makes sense.
Yes, I agree, and I think there was a big peace anchorage in the Cold War period and immediate post-Cold War period, which was the United States. I mean, um, there were two powers, two superpowers in the Cold War period, and after the Cold War ended, for a time, it was thought there was one superpower that was sort of guarantor of peace. No one could do anything that the United States didn't want. And what's happening now, which is the world of multipolar world that's been developing, we don't quite grasp yet the fact that it reflects the decline of the United States.
Mm.
The United States can no longer be the world's policeman. I mean, messily and reluctantly, this has dawned on the American foreign policy establishment, and Trump has sort of expressed it more messily than most. America is a big regional power now. It wants to take it wants to guard its own continents, but and that has always involved looking to the Pacific as well, but not Europe. I mean, the American involvement in Europe in a strategic sense is quite recent. It really started in the First World War, then it went into isolation, and then re-emerged in the Second World War, when America was brought into the Second World War by Hitler. I mean, we often forget that it was Hitler who declared war on the United States, not the
Yeah.
United States who declared war on Hitler. Anyway, it was brought in, then kept in by the Cold War. But in a way, it wasn't so much, it was historically not at the center of United States national interests or national thinking, the defense of Europe, I'm talking about. Now, it says, okay, we can't be policemen of the world. Which bits of the world are we going to sort of dispossess? And Europe comes into the comes up there. So that is part of what's going on. Without the United States peacekeeper, the world suddenly seems much more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about whether it really was a peacekeeper. If you
Yeah, I mean, you can, of course,
if
absolutely.
you look at the Vietnam War, if you
Yeah,
look at the interventions in the 1970s in Central America, if you look at obviously what happened in the Middle East
yeah,
and so on. I mean, the question mark for me there is actually whether we've gone through a period of kind of unfreezing where we've had this unipolar moment where in which the Americans have managed to occupy the kind of hegemonic position, and we're going to refreeze back into a new Cold War with actually, the Chinese and the Americans as the two dominant global powers. I mean, I don't actually see Russia as a dominant global power, despite the fact that it has 6,000 nuclear weapons. Economically, it's a middle power really, but with globally significance of nuclear capabilities. Of course. But anyway, with that refreezing of a new Cold War between China and the US, actually then provides a foundation for stability in a multipolar world in the way that we saw, largely in the period after World War II, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but we haven't got there yet because the freezing of the frontiers, if you like, which will mark the Cold War period. I mean, the frontiers were occupied after the Second World War, and they were frozen essentially. That was the way the world. There were conflicts on the peripheries, true enough, but the main configurations were as they were left by the armies of 1945.
Yeah, of course.
Now, we have no such um, we have no such agreement on Taiwan. I mean, that must, and in fact, I mean, what we're reading in our press, not all of our press, but some of it, is that Xi has said China must be prepared for war over Taiwan by 2017. Some headline I read in some newspaper. So there's what America and China should be talking about is what is going to be the status of Taiwan in the next 50 years. Let's agree on that. Let's try to agree on that. So that is something that we don't quarrel about anymore. Are they trying to do that? I don't know. But and ditto the status of other areas in Southeast Asia. I mean, this is where diplomacy should surely come into its own. Otherwise, we drift into an unresolved war, which could easily then spill over into a devastating.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But I mean, that diplomacy has to. I suppose the challenge for us in the UK and any other country, including in Asia, too, is to make sense of how we can support diplomatic engagement, positive diplomatic engagement between the US and China to kind of de-risk,
Yeah,
the future. Really,
yeah.
because Chinese dominance is a given that we just have to accept. I'm not sure that we have accepted it yet, but it is, it's. I think it's inevitable, and we just kind of have to make sense of how we engage with that. The reality is going to be great power competition between the US and China, and our effort should be to kind of maintain some sort of balance in that global, order, and
That's
also, of
what it
course,
should be. Yeah.
to make sense of what that means for kind of global trade and that sort of thing, to avoid a complete splitting down the middle of the of the globe. But and of course, in none of these conversations that we talk about the role of India, as well. So actually, all of this I think comes back to what role does the UN play in terms of an intergovernmental
Mhm.
meeting point for people to talk about these big issues and to deconflict on the basis that the Security Council is no longer an effective
Yeah.
mechanism if it ever
Those
really
were the
was.
two institutions, two post-Second War institutions that were shunted to one side. One of them was, of course, the UN, and particularly most of it is just a talking shop, but the UN Security Council was meant to be an actor in the post-war world, which it has stopped being. And the other institution that's been completely sidelined is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and what are known as the Bretton Woods institutions,
Mm.
which were supposed to guarantee a free economic world, a world of economic freedom. If these institutions were in place, then of course you could have free trade, you could have free capital movements and other things, because they wouldn't be dangerous, they wouldn't be weaponized. There was a guarantee against them being weaponized. Now these institutions have been completely sidelined, and in fact, economic relations are being weaponized the whole time. I mean, we talk about China illegally, or India, let's say, illegally evading sanctions, but sanctions are illegal. I mean, they're not the sanctions we impose, if we want to really be strict about the rule of law, they're not authorized by the Security Council. They're sanctions we impose. Um, uh, and I suppose we have a right to impose these sort of sanctions, but do we have a right to then enforce them by force if necessary? I mean, is that all within the Charter? You're the expert on this because you dealt with all these sanction issues when you were in Moscow. But I mean, I'm very unclear about it. We talk about countries illegally evading our sanctions as though their protection against our sanction is an illegal act.
Yeah, I suppose it's illegal in terms of domestic law because our sanctions are written into UK domestic law. That the question is whether they're illegal under international law, and there I'm clear that they're not illegal under international law. So I think that's where people play. I mean, diplomats love playing, and politicians love playing with forms of wording, right? So they're on a purely domestic basis, they can claim sanctions evasion as illegal because we have a law, but that
Yeah.
doesn't make them legal under international law. And I think that is the point. That is a point that the BRICS grouping have been making sort of for many times. And on the IMF, I'd say the IMF has become weaponized. You look at the decisions it's taken on the Ukraine program since
Yep.
2014, where Ukraine defaulted in effectively defaulted in 2014, but actually wasn't declared in default by the IMF on the basis of an 11th hour decision
I didn't
the
know
night
that
before they're
actually.
going to
I didn't.
default
Interesting.
on this kind of bond payment to Russia. You know,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
Putin gave Yanukovych 15 billion in
That's right. I don't know. I
gave over
remember.
the first 3 billion in installment. Ukraine refused to pay it, and they're quickly in default as a result. It probably actually happened in 2015 or 2014. I get my dates wrong, but I mean the IMF has been politicized for a long time, and I think the question is, is the global financial architecture an institution, or is it a jigsaw of institutions, and how they can collaborate well through, like the G20 and things like that? I mean, do we need to kind of reinvigorate the G20 as a kind of a truly global meeting point for discussion on international financial regulations rather than relying on the old Bretton Woods? Certainly the
Yeah.
Brits,
Well,
that's
I
where the
don't
Brits are.
think you see. I don't think we've got any basis now for the kind of securities that worked under the previous system. For example, who's going to keep their reserves in any currency if there's a chance that they'll be frozen
Yeah, well, no,
for
exactly. Well,
for
and
for
of
for,
course
for
they're not.
geopolitical reasons?
They're not. I mean, they're keeping them in gold. That's why
They
gold is
keep them in
booming.
gold. So, I mean, that is one sort of, if you have gold, you don't need a world government. But if you don't have gold, you do need some world authority, which is as good as gold. But so you're right, crypto currencies, gold currencies, these are all things that come back in the reckoning, but they're not as efficient as uh, state guaranteed arrangement. They're not as efficient, and they could easily. There's no obvious enforcement
Yeah,
of the standards that are set up. So that's one thing that's happening. And trade. I mean, if trade is sanctioned, I mean, where is free trade? I mean, where is the freedom of trade in a world today in which your ships could be seized because they're evading some sanctions that have been imposed by someone else on them? I mean, and then
yeah,
what about supply chains? I mean, one of the things that the British Navy and no doubt the American forces did was to guarantee supply routes.
yeah,
But if there's no one to guarantee supply routes, you must then have everything inside you that you need for your security inside your country because you can't guarantee of being able to obtain it with all these spy ships prowling around mapping your underground communications and
mapping Western Supermare from the Bristol
mapping
Channel.
West exactly. So you're in this sort of world. And so the geopolitical completely swamps the economic. The economics are all in favor of an open world economy. That is the best sort of thing for everyone. But the geopolitics sort of simply obliterates it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, I mean, I think I get the impression that China doesn't see itself as a threat to kind of global shipping routes, despite its claims on Taiwan, which is in any case internationally recognized to be part of China. Let's never forget that when we get caught up talking about Taiwan. Nobody wants to see a war there, obviously. But I mean, through the Belt and Road Initiative, that they've been facilitating trade. There have been questions about all their excess capital and cheap EVs, coming into our marketplace and so on. But actually, that's in part a byproduct of the economic systems that we built
Yeah,
in the 1980s as we deindustrialized. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
but anyway, I mean, that's a wider discussion that we probably didn't have
That's
time
a
for
wider discussion.
today. But I'd like to finish it, if I may, by saying that actually the world this only occurred to me as we're talking just now, but Europe has become so dysfunctional that it's actually through sanctions, it's imposed an economic blockade on itself.
Yeah, absolutely. No, they're consequential, as the phrase is, in the wrong way.
Yes, yes. Anyway, that was I mean, I wasn't expecting the conversation to go in that direction, but I'm glad that it did because I personally found it really, really interesting, and I hope you did as well. I certainly hope the viewers did. So please do. Thank you for watching, firstly, but also please continue to support my peacemongering efforts, which often feels like swimming uphill through treacle, if I'm being completely honest. But do like and subscribe to this video if you found it informative. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your race, religion, nationality, I wish you all very much peace. And Robert, Lord Skidelsky, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.